Hi everyone, my name is Charlene. We are now on lesson 6 and we will be learning about behaviorist perspective. For this lesson, we have 3 learning objectives. First is to explain briefly about the behaviorist perspective. Second is to identify the similarities and differences between the basic principles that fall under behaviorism and neo-behaviorism. And third is to determine how to apply these basic principles to improve the learning process. The behaviorist perspective is based on the theories of learning that focus on the effect of the environment on behavior. It is divided into 2 groups, mainly behaviorism and neo-behaviorism. The theories that fall under behaviorism include Pavlov's classical conditioning, Thorndike's connectionism, and Skinner's operant conditioning, while the theories that fall under neo-behaviorism include Tolman's purposive behaviorism and Bandura's social learning theory. The theory of behaviorism focuses on the study of observable and measurable behavior. It emphasizes that behavior is mostly learned through conditioning and reinforcement. However, it does not give much attention to the mind and the possibility of a thought process occurring in the mind. Now let us first discuss Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning. He is a Russian physiologist and he is known for his work in classical conditioning or stimulus substitution. His most renowned experiment involved a meat, a dog, and a bell. Primarily, he was measuring the dog's salivation to study digestion. During his experiment, Pavlov was able to identify 4 key elements, and these are the following. Unconditioned stimulus. This is the original or naturally occurring stimulus. This is the stimulus that leads to the reflex response. Now the term unconditioned here means unlearned. Then we have the unconditioned response. This is the response to the unconditioned stimulus. It is unlearned and occurs due to the genetic wiring in one's nervous system. Then we have the conditioned stimulus. Almost any kind of stimulus can be associated with the unconditioned stimulus if it is paired with it several times. And then we have the conditioned response. This is the response to the conditioned stimulus. It is not usually quite as strong as the unconditioned response. However, it is essentially the same response. This is an illustration of Pavlov's experiment. In his first study, the sign of the food itself became a stimulus for salivation before the food was given to the dogs. In the second scenario, when the dog heard the sound of the bell, it did not elicit any response. At this point, the bell is called a neutral stimulus since it does not affect salivation. But during conditioning, every time the dogs got their food, they saw the bell. After conditioning, the bell, through repeated pairing with the food, eventually causes the same kind of reflexive response, and learning takes place. The neutral stimulus, which is the bell, is now called a conditioned stimulus. Pavlov also had the following findings in his experiment. First is stimulus generalization. Once a dog has learned to salivate by only hearing the sound of the bell, it will start to salivate when the dog hears another similar sound to the bell. Then we have this extinction. If you discontinue pairing the bell with food, salivation will eventually cease in response to the bell. Then we have spontaneous recovery. Extinguished responses can be recovered after a time, but will soon extinguish again if the dog is presented with food. Discrimination. The dog could learn to discriminate between similar bells or stimuli and differentiate which bell sound would result in the presentation of food. And lastly, we have higher order conditioning. Once a dog has been conditioned to associate the bell with food, another unconditioned stimulus, such as blinking of the light, is paired simultaneously with the bell. Eventually, the dog will start to salivate at the blinking light without hearing a bell. Let us move on to Edward Thorndike's connectionism theory. His theory states that learning has taken place when a strong connection or bond between stimulus and response is formed. These associations or habits strengthens or weakens by the nature and frequency of the SR pairings. He stated that there are three primary laws. First, we have the law of effect, the law of exercise, and the law of readiness. The law of effect states that the connection between the stimulus and the response is strengthened when the consequence is positive and weakened when the consequence is negative. The law of exercise states that the more SR bond is practiced, the stronger it will become. And the law of readiness states that the more readiness the learner has to respond to the stimulus, the stronger will be the bond between them. Let's move on to B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. Skinner also believed in the stimulus-response pattern of conditioned behavior. His theory focuses only on the changes in observable behavior, excluding any likelihood of any process taking place in the mind. Operant conditioning is based on the notion that learning is a result of a change in overt behavior. When a particular SR pattern is reinforced or rewarded, the individual is conditioned to the response. The key element in Skinner's theory is reinforcement. A reinforcer is anything that strengthens the desired response. We have a positive reinforcer and a negative reinforcer. A positive reinforcer is any stimulus that is given or added to increase the response. For example, a preschool teacher promises extra playtime to her students who behave during the lesson. Negative reinforcer is any stimulus that results in the increased frequency of a response when it is withdrawn or removed. Note that negative reinforcer is not a punishment but as a reward. Example, a teacher announces that a student who gets an average grade of 1.75 for 2 grading periods will no longer take the final examination. The negative reinforcer is removing the final exam. Next, we have extinction or non-reinforcement. Skinner has also looked into this. Responses that are not reinforced are not likely to be repeated. So for example, for special education practitioners, they ignore a student's attention-seeking behavior to extinguish the manifestation of that behavior. Now let's move on to Neo-Behaviorism. New theories maintained some of the behaviorist concepts, but excluded the other works and added new ideas that appeared to be associated with the cognitive views of learning. First, we have Edward Tolman's Purposive Behaviorism. He believed that learning is a cognitive process and emphasized that the relationships between stimuli rather than stimulus response. He said that a new stimulus becomes associated with already meaningful stimuli through a series of pairings and that there is no need for reinforcement to establish learning. The following are Tolman's key concepts in his theory. First, learning is always purposive and goal-directed. He was able to prove in his experiment that cognitive maps exist in rats. He believed in latent learning. He explained the concept of an intervening variable and emphasized that reinforcement is not essential for learning. Let us move on to Albert Bandura's social learning theory, which focuses on on learning that occurs within a social context. It gives consideration that people learn from one another, including concepts such as observational learning, imitation, and modeling. The general principles of the social learning theory are the following. First, people can learn by observing the behavior of others and the outcomes of those behaviors. Learning can occur without a change in behavior. Cognition plays a role in learning, and social learning theory can be considered a bridge or a transition between behaviorist learning theories and cognitive learning theories. Now, this is how the environment reinforces and punishes modeling. First, the observer is reinforced by the model. Second, the observer is reinforced by a third person. Third, the imitated behavior itself leads to reinforcing consequences. And fourth, the consequences of the model's behavior affect the observer's behavior vicariously. Contemporary social learning perspective of reinforcement and punishment include the following. The contemporary theory proposes that both reinforcement and punishment have indirect effects on learning. Reinforcement and punishment influence the extent to which an individual exhibits behavior that has been learned. And the expectation of reinforcement influences cognitive processes that promote learning. The following are the cognitive factors in social learning. First is learning without performance. Next is cognitive processing during learning, expectations, reciprocal causation, and modeling. Behaviors that can be learned through modeling are aggression and moral thinking and behavior. For aggression, research indicates that children become more aggressive when they observe aggressive or violent models. On the other hand, for moral thinking and moral behavior, they are widely influenced by observation and modeling. It includes moral judgments regarding what is right and wrong. The following are the conditions necessary for effective modeling to occur. First is attention. The person must pay attention to the model. Retention. The observer must be able to remember what he has observed. Motor reproduction. The observer must be able to replicate the behavior that the model has just demonstrated. And last, motivation. The learners must want to demonstrate what he or she has learned. So that would be all for today. Thank you for listening. Remember, according to Aristotle, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. I'll see you in my next video. Have a nice day.